Hello and welcome to session 3 of our DevOps course. In this session I'm going to look specifically at how to set up a user account and how to set up an application that will allow you to add users and remove users. We're going to use Spring MVC as we did previously, and this application is standalone, but you can combine it with the work we did last week using Leaflet to produce a more full application for your assessment. So let's get started. And I think the easiest way to get started with this is to actually run the application. So let me get that going now. I'm going to use Spring Boot. And with any luck the application will start up. You'll need to have compiled the application before you do this, but you'll know how to do that. So that's the application running, and let me show you what it looks like. So if I go to localhost 8080, you'll see that there's a simple home page that gives you the information that you need. Now there are two types of users that are pre-configured for you. One is an administrator with global admin privileges, and one is a user with just simple user privileges. So I'm just going to copy the username and password for the global admin, and then I'm going to go to the home page. And on the home page you can see that we have basically a number of tabs, so home, about, contact, which are basically anything you want to put there basically. You can change the header any way you wish. And then we've got this ability to log in or create a new account. Now just before I go here, if I go back to that original home page that we were talking about, you can see that the navigation bar is based on this Bootstrap starter HTML, which I've also included as an example. So we're using Bootstrap, and you can see that it has everything here you might need: contact, about, home, and nav guard docs and whatever. So the actual JSPs that I've created are using very similar Bootstrap to this particular starter page. Okay, so that's just by the way to get you going. If I go back to my application on localhost and go back to my home page, and then if I log in or create a new account, I'm going to log in using this admin username, and when we log in we can see we're successfully logged in, and now I can edit my user profile, which allows me to put in the address, postcode and information, and I can also change the status of the user. Now if I go back to the other user that's in the list, so if I go to admin and I go to manage users, then if I try and modify the second user, then I can actually change them from the role of customer to the role of administrator, and I can disable that user if I wish, in which case they won't be able to log in, or I can do it. I can update their password and everything. So the administrator can modify other users. A single user can only modify themselves, and they cannot give themselves increased privileges if they aren't an administrator. So that's very simply how it works. You'll see that under the admin tab there's also manage catalog. There is no catalog, it just goes to an error page, but that's just there to show you what would happen. And then the other pages, the home and the about and whatever, don't have anything on them at the moment. Okay, so how is that done? Well, if we actually go to the application, first thing I want to do is to look at the source page for the web app. So if we go to the web app itself and we look at the view, we can see that there are a number of JSPs here. Now the key to this is that there's a header JSP and there's a footer JSP. If I look at the header JSP, this is going to be the top of the page, and it provides a body and it provides information about which page is selected, and further down you've got the ability to jump into the rest of the page. Okay, so that's the header. And then the footer, which goes at the bottom of the page, is very, very simple. There's not much in that at all. Okay. Now, the header and the footer in themselves don't do enough. So what you actually need to have is the actual page that you're going to call up. So if I go to the home.jsp, we can see that this starts the JSP, and then it includes the header at the top of the page, and it includes the footer at the bottom of the page, and then the main page just contains error messages or messages if they're required. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of how it all works. Basically, every page has got its own header and footer, and the only other thing just to say about the header, if I go back to the header, is that what we do actually do is we change the button that's actually activated depending on which page is in. So we have a request which has got the selected page, and if the selected page is home, then we activate the home button. If it's about, we activate the about button. So that's what gives you this ability to see, we're on the home page, or we're on the about page, or on the contact page, or whatever. Okay, so that's done by just changing the top of the header depending on the page. You can look at the code and see how that works. Okay, so that is the JSPs themselves, and the JSPs are controlled by a page controller. So if I jump back in to the actual Java and I go under under the user Spring web and look at the MVC controller. So the MVC controller here is very simple, and what it's doing is basically if we basically go to the initial root of the page, that'll throw us to the index page. If we go to home, then it will take us to the home page, and so on. If we go to about, it'll go to the about page. If we go to contact, it'll go to the contact page. So that's very, very simple. And then there's an exception handler, which if anything goes wrong when we're rendering up the page, that will throw us to what's called the error page, which is just another JSP that we have. So that's how we handle those basic JSPs, and probably what you would want to do is add in your JSP with your leaflet session into one of these. How then do we handle users? Well, the user and login controller is another request mapping, but in this case we've got login and we've got logout, and under login and logout we've got the ability to post information about the username and password, and a second password if we're creating a new password. So in this case, what it does is it takes into account the user mode, user role. So the users can have the role of anonymous, or a customer, or an administrator, and depending on the user that was actually logged in, then we get the session user, we get the user role, and then we determine what we're going to do with it. Again, you'll have to work your way through this code to understand what is going on. Okay, but this allows you to register a user and to update a user, and it's just a bit more sophisticated in what the controller is doing, but you can just lift this and use this. Okay, the rest of this application is exactly the same as we did before. We have a model, in which case the model has a user, and the user's first name, second name, user word, and password. The one thing to realize is that we never save the actual password in the database, we save the hashed password in the database. And we use a method which is here under password, called password utils, to actually generate the hashed password, and then also to check the password against the password that's been put in. So we only ever store the hashed password in the database, never the actual password, and we use this BC crypt library to actually hash the password before it's pushed into the database. And then under the user, we go back to this, we go down to where we look at the password, you see that the passwords are not saved, they're set as transient, but then when we actually set the hashed password, we use the password utils to hash it. Okay, so that's a very simple way of making sure we never save a password in the database. So the user also has a user role, and that's basically an enum, and you could add extra rules in if you wished, and those rules will show up. So if you've got other rules you want to include, but at the moment basically the user shows up as anonymous if they've just come and they've not actually logged in. If they have logged in with a real account, then they'll either be a customer or an administrator, depending on what the privilege is they have. And then finally, users have an address, and this address is set as embeddable. Now all that means is that in the user, whenever we see address, we will see that it's embedded. Now all that does is add extra columns into the row in the database. It means that we don't have a separate table that we're referencing. We're simply saying that the address data is going to be embedded in that table as extra columns in the data in that table, and embedded tells us that. The other stuff at the top, the ID and the generated value, it's exactly the same as we had before. So really this application is very similar to the previous application. The only thing that's different is that there's a few extra little bits around how the actual DAO is set up, and this persistence JPA config actually sets up the database for us, and a lot of this in our previous example is actually just done for you by Spring Boot, but in this example I've done a lot more of the work out front for you to see what's going on, setting up the entity manager and setting up the various properties. But it's doing the same thing, and in fact you could use the previous way of setting up the database and simplify this if you wished, but I'll leave that to your own homework to do that. You can see the user repository is actually quite simple, but again we're using a JPA repository, and what's different about this is that we're actually using a query language here. Select user from user where username equals username, and then select user from user where username is first name and second name equals second name. So we're not just doing a get or a get all like we did previously, we're actually doing some searches in the database, and the language we're using for doing that is JPA query language, which is very like SQL, but it isn't SQL, but it is a query we've set up in the database. So basically whenever this method is called, then the username method will be used within that query to get access to the data in the database. When the application starts up, one of the things it does do is it populates the database on start, and again it does it a different way to previously, but it has exactly the same effect. Basically whenever we populate the database on start, this post construct basically initializes the database. So once this particular class has been initialized, then this init database is called, and we create a new user called admin user, and we add that to the user repository, and the same happens with the default user. So this just was a way of initializing the database, very similar to what we did previously, but a little bit more sophisticated in how it goes about it. The rest of the classes are pretty self-explanatory. I won't go into them in any detail, but if we go into the resources, what you will see is that there's the application properties that we had previously, which just contains the JSP stuff, but we now have another application properties which is for the persistence, and this is actually setting up the database. And again, you can change these values if you want to use MySQL or another different type of database. All we're doing is just separating this out, and that means that under the tests, and there's quite a lot of testing that's done here, we can actually have different resources that are used for testing. So the persistence test.properties are used in the test, and that saves the database in a file under the target directory. So it's just a different way of doing it. So what it means is that when we're actually testing our application, we test it using a local database, but when you're actually using it in Angular, you might be wanting to use the database that's put in the persistence app.properties file. I don't think there's anything else I really need to show you about this. The tests themselves, we have a password test that tests the utility that actually creates a password and tests that it works. And then under the user tests, we've got stuff that basically tests the DAO. And in this case, we're actually picking up the persistent test.properties to actually do our user repository test. And our user repository test basically is loading up Spring, and then it's using the user repository and it's doing things with the user repository here to make sure that it works. So this is slightly more sophisticated again than the last time. This time we're actually spinning up our application and we're running tests against it as part of the test, and that's really what this stuff at the top is doing. It's saying run with the Spring JUnit class runner, use these classes to give us our configuration, and then auto-wire in the user repository and then run tests against the user repository. Okay, so a little bit more to think about in this particular example, but it's taking you further into Spring. It's giving you a bit more about how you can test applications with Spring, and it's now giving you how you can create users in your application and allow them to do things within the application. Hopefully that is enough to get you going for this week, and I shall see you in class. Thank you very much.